Before we begin, if you enjoy these quiet journeys into history, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us continue creating long, calming documentaries to ease you into rest. Let's see if we can reach 100 likes on this video together. And if you'd like, share in the comments what time it is, where you're listening from, and where in the world you are joining us tonight. Asterisk, the year was 1930, and for the farmers of the American Great Plains, the earth itself began to change. For decades, this vast expanse, stretching from Texas northward into Nebraska, had been celebrated as the breadbasket of a growing nation. Families moved west with the promise of fertile soil and an endless horizon where wheat, corn, and cotton could be coaxed from the ground in abundance. Yet beneath this vision of prosperity, something fragile had been forming, a landscape pushed beyond its limits. A soil tilled too often, and a climate ready to remind people that human confidence meant very little against the rhythms of wind and sky. You can imagine walking along one of those farms in the late 1920s. The fields spread wide under an open sky. The plows had torn deep into the sod, overturning layers of soil that had once been held together by the roots of native grasses. Those grasses, for centuries, had anchored the earth against the sharp winds that swept across the plains. Once they were gone, the land became vulnerable. When rains began to fail, the soil loosened, dried, and turned to dust. It was slow at first, a dry year, then another. Crops failed in patches, but many still believed that rain would return, as it always had. Yet, as 1931 stretched on, the sky often held no clouds, and the heat pressed downward. Families who had known hardship before now began to see it deepen into something different. Farmers harvested little, sometimes nothing at all. Those who had borrowed money for tractors, seed, or land struggled to repay debts. Banks closed on homesteads, while farmers stared helplessly at fields that produced less each season. And then, in 1932, the wind began to rise. Not just ordinary gusts, but sweeping currents that carried with them the very soil meant to nourish the crops. At first it was a haze, a brown cloud rolling over the horizon, but soon the storms became frequent, violent, and suffocating. They called it the Dust Bowl. The storms were unlike anything most people had ever experienced. They swept across counties, sometimes states, blotting out the sun. By midday, a farm could be cast in darkness, the air filled with choking grit. Dust seeped into houses, no matter how carefully windows and doors were sealed. It layered itself over furniture, into food, into lungs. Families wrapped wet cloths around their faces and placed damp sheets over cribs to protect their children. Livestock suffocated, fields disappeared, and machines clogged with sand-like soil. Ordinary life became a battle against dust. Women swept floors multiple times a day, only to find them covered again within hours. Families shook out blankets filled with dirt, then tried to sleep through the sound of wind rattling the walls and grit pelting against windows. Men walked their fields, unable to see beyond a few feet, wondering if there would be anything left of their crops when the sky cleared. For those who lived through it, there was a strange, haunting memory of sound, the steady roar of wind carrying dust, a low moan across the plains. The storms were not brief, some lasted hours, others days. Children learned to fear the sight of a black horizon, a curtain of earth rising into the sky and rolling toward them. Schools closed when the storms hit, as teachers struggled to keep children safe from dust inhalation. The government, too, began to notice. Reports described towns buried in soil, crops lost for entire seasons, and families abandoning their homes. In Washington, policymakers debated what could be done. Some suggested new farming techniques, crop rotation, contour plowing, the planting of shelter pallets of trees to hold the soil in place. Yet for many families, such advice came too late. The Dust Bowl was not only an environmental disaster, but also a human one. Farmers who had once been proud of their independence now faced the shame of relief lines. Families who had fed a nation now struggled to feed themselves. Stories spread of children fainting in school from hunger, of families bartering precious possessions for sacks of flour, parents leaving their land to search for work in distant states. But leaving was not easy. Cars broke down on the dusty roads, their engines clogged by soil. Trains carried migrants westward, but not everyone could afford the fare. Those who managed to reach California or other states often found only more hardship, low wages, crowded camps, and hostility from locals who saw migrants as competition. And so, the Dust Bowl became a symbol of despair, but also of endurance. Those who remained on the land did what they could. Some planted smaller gardens close to their homes, protected by makeshift windbreaks. Others took government aid reluctantly, seeing it as the only way to keep their families alive. Still others left, carrying their hopes in battered trucks piled with furniture, tools, and the remnants of a life built on fragile soil. The Dust Bowl was more than a natural disaster. It was a collision between human ambition and environmental reality. The plows had turned too deep, the fields had stretched too wide, and the rains had failed when they were needed most. Yet, in the midst of this collapse, people found ways to endure. They shared food with neighbors, repaired homes together, and leaned on community in ways they never had before. For some, survival meant accepting change. They learned new farming methods, experimented with crops that resisted drought, or shifted to smaller herds of livestock. Government programs began to provide seed loans, emergency food, and even wages for work on conservation projects. But all of this took time, and time was often the one resource families did not have. As you picture those families sitting at dinner tables where the food was scarce and the air carried the taste of earth, you may wonder, how long can people live with the land itself turning against them? How much resilience can be drawn from the human spirit when every harvest ends in dust? And when the storms finally cleared, would the land ever be the same again, or had the choices of one generation already changed the future forever? Asterisk, the storms did not relent. By 1933, the Great Plains had become a theater of recurring disaster. Entire seasons passed with little rain, and when the skies did open, the showers often came too late, washing away what little soil still clung to the ground. Families began to measure time, not by harvests or holidays, but by dust storms, the black blizzard of April, the storm that buried fence posts in June, the one that swallowed barns in September. The calendar of ordinary life was replaced by a calendar of loss. The most infamous storm struck on April 14th, 1935. It became known as Black Sunday. That morning, the sky above parts of Oklahoma, Texas, and Kansas was bright, clear, and deceptively calm. Families who had endured months of storms thought perhaps a reprieve had come. As children played outside, women hung laundry, and men checked fences and fields. But in the afternoon, a wall appeared on the horizon, towering, black, and moving faster than anyone thought possible. Eyewitnesses recalled the moment the sky turned to night. Chickens roosted, thinking it was evening. Streetlights flickered on in towns, though it was still mid-afternoon. Within minutes, the storm enveloped everything. Some people stumbled home, unable to see their own hands. Others clutched children, undercoats, blindly searching for shelter. When it passed, the dust had buried homes, choked livestock, and left behind an eerie silence. Newspapers across the country printed images of people wrapped in cloths, eyes squinting against clouds of dirt, their faces worn with fatigue. Events like Black Sunday forced the rest of the nation to reckon with the scale of the disaster. Dust Bowl was no longer a local tragedy, it was a national crisis. Washington politicians, who had once seen the plains as distant farmland, now debated what role the federal government should play in rescuing not only the people, but the land itself. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, still in the early years of his New Deal, recognized that the Dust Bowl symbolized something larger, a nation's vulnerability. His administration launched a series of programs aimed at both immediate relief and long-term recovery. The Soil Conservation Service was born, teaching farmers how to rotate crops, terrace their fields, and plant cover grasses that would anchor the earth. The Civilian Conservation Corps sent young men to the plains to plant millions of trees, creating shelter belts designed to slow the winds. These projects were often tedious digging, planting, and repairing in conditions that seemed hopeless, but they marked the beginning of a new understanding that land needed care, not just extraction. Still, government action could not erase the human suffering of those years. Consider the families who chose to leave. Historians estimate that by the end of the 1930s, nearly 2.5 million people had fled the Dust Bowl states, making it the largest migration in American history within such a short span. Cars and the journey was rarely smooth, roads filled with dust, engines overheated, and tires shredded. Families camped along highways, cooking meager meals over fires of twigs and scraps. At night, they slept under the stars, sometimes huddled in the very cars that carried them. Children asked when they would reach the promised land, but their parents often had no answer. The West seemed close on a map, but endless when traveled mile by mile. Arriving in California did not guarantee relief. Locals, already struggling under Depression-era pressures, often viewed migrants with suspicion. They called them Okies, a term that came to be used broadly, sometimes with disdain for anyone fleeing the plains. Camps for migrant workers sprouted in orchards and fields. Families lived in tents, lean-tos, or shacks cobbled together from scraps of wood and tin. Jobs were scarce, wages were low, and the work picking fruit or cotton was exhausting. Children, as young as 6, labored beside their parents. Writers and photographers brought these scenes to national attention. John Steinbeck, in The Grapes of Wrath, fictionalized the struggles of migrant families, while photographers like Dorothea Lange captured stark images: a mother's lined face, children leaning on her shoulders, their eyes filled with worry. These portrayals gave voice to those who had little, reminding distant audiences that the Depression was not only about numbers on Wall Street, but about the daily endurance of ordinary people. Those who stayed behind on the plains faced a different kind of test. They lived in houses where dust layered every surface, where water had to be hauled from distant wells, and where crops failed year after year. Some farmers experimented with planting new grasses to hold the soil, encouraged by government agencies. Others took jobs in nearby towns, leaving fields to lie fallow in the hope that someday the land would heal. Schools struggled as families moved away, leaving behind half-empty classrooms. Teachers taught by lamplight when storms darkened the sky, pausing lessons when children coughed uncontrollably from dust inhalation. Churches prayed for rain week after week, filling pews with farmers in worn clothes and mothers with babies wrapped in cloths. The Dust Bowl also revealed deep inequalities. Families with savings or larger farms sometimes weathered the crisis more easily. Tenant farmers, sharecroppers, and small landholders often had no cushion, no bank accounts, no reserves of food or money. When the storms destroyed their crops, they lost everything. Landlords evicted them, and they joined the growing ranks of migrants. Health became another shadow over these years. Dust pneumonia condition caused by breathing in fine soil particles became common. Doctors described lungs coated in dust, children struggling to breathe, and elders weakened beyond recovery. Malnutrition compounded the problem. Even when food was available, it was limited to monotonous diets, beans, bread, or whatever could be stretched across a family. Meat and fresh vegetables became rare luxuries, and yet Amid despair, communities clung to rituals that gave life a sense of continuity. Neighbors gathered for potluck suppers, even if the dishes were meager. School plays went on, though costumes were stitched from flour sacks. Radio broadcasts brought music and Roosevelt's fireside chats, crackling through static and dust. These small moments of normalcy helped people endure what might otherwise have felt unbearable. By the mid-1930s, some progress became visible. Shelter belts of trees began to rise across the plains. Farmers experimented with new plowing techniques, leaving strips of land unplowed to act as barriers. Federal relief checks, though modest, kept families from starvation. Yet the storms did not vanish. They came in cycles, testing every improvement, reminding families that the land could not be controlled so easily. Looking back, the Dust Bowl was not simply a story of environmental collapse, but of adaptation. It forced Americans to reconsider their relationship with the land, their reliance on technology, and their belief in limitless expansion. It revealed that survival sometimes meant endurance, but also sometimes meant leaving behind everything known. And so, the image of a child clinging to a parent's hand as dust swirls around them remains fixed in history, not just as a moment of suffering, but as a reminder of resilience. Still, one question lingered as storms continued into the late 1930s. Could the land and the families tied to it ever fully recover? Asterisk, by the late 1930s, the Dust Bowl had become more than a passing crisis. It was a defining feature of the Great Depression, reshaping landscapes, families, and government policy alike. The storms still came, sweeping across the plains with their familiar roar. But by then, people had begun to fight back, not with force, but with patience, adaptation, and the slow discipline of conservation. The government's Soil Conservation Service encouraged practices that, at first, seemed unusual to farmers accustomed to maximizing every acre. Fields were divided into strips, alternating crops with bare fallow soil to break the wind. Contour plowing, guiding furrows along the natural shape of hills, helped keep water from running off too quickly. Cover crops, like sorghum or alfalfa, were planted not to be sold, but to protect the earth itself. These methods demanded a change in mindset. No longer could farmers think only of immediate yields. They had to think of the land as something to be sustained across generations. Slowly, results emerged. In places where trees had been planted as windbreaks, the storms weakened. Where grasses had returned, the soil stayed put. The black walls of dust still rose, but they did not strip the earth as completely as before. Farmers, though weary, began to see hope in the small green shoots that resisted the wind. At the same time, migration continued. By 1940, vast numbers of families had permanently left the plains. California's population swelled with migrants who worked at the orchards, vineyards, and fields, while others settled in industrial towns, taking factory jobs. For many, the dream of returning home faded, placed by the reality of new lives built far from the farms that had once defined them. The Dust Bowl also transformed politics. Roosevelt's New Deal became more than a set of emergency measures. It became a philosophy of government intervention in daily life. Programs like the Agricultural Adjustment Act reshaped farming, paying farmers to limit production and conserve soil. Agencies hired scientists, agronomists, and engineers to study the land in ways never attempted before. The idea that government bore responsibility for protecting both people and environment took deeper root in American consciousness. In popular culture, the Dust Bowl became a symbol of endurance. Writers and musicians told its story, sometimes in sorrow, sometimes in defiance. Woody Guthrie, the folk singer born in Oklahoma, wrote ballads about the storm songs that captured both the bitterness and resilience of those who lived through them. Its verses, sung to the strum of a guitar, spread stories of dusty old dust and hard traveling across the country. turning personal tragedy into shared memory. But beneath the cultural echoes lay the quieter stories of ordinary families who found ways to survive. Mothers sewed dresses from feed sacks, patched and repatched until the cloth wore thin. Children carried tin lunch pails to school with only bread inside, yet still traded bites with friends so no one felt entirely empty. Men gathered in town squares, discussing crop prices that never rose, but still planned the next planting with stubborn determination. The storms, however, were relentless in their reminders. In 1938, another massive dust storm rolled across the plains, carrying soil as far as Washington, D.C., when the dark cloud settled over the Capitol. It made lawmakers realize that the Dust Bowl was not only a regional issue. Soil from Kansas and Oklahoma fell on the steps of the Capitol, a stark demonstration that nature's crisis knew no boundaries. Yet, change was coming. By the end of the decade, the weather began to shift. Rains returned in more consistent cycles. Fields that had lain barren for years began to show signs of recovery. Crops sprouted again, though farmers approached them with new caution. The land was healing, though scarred, and people had learned that prosperity could not be assumed, but had to be earned through balance with the earth. The approach of World War II also altered the picture. As factories expanded to supply war demands, jobs opened across the country. Families who had fled the Dust Bowl found steady work in shipyards, aircraft plants. Today, the Dust Bowl is remembered not only as a natural disaster, but as a turning point. It forced Americans to recognize that the land is not an endless resource. It showed that the cycles of nature can humble even the most confident farmers, and that recovery requires both human cooperation and patience. And so, the story of the Dust Bowl ends not with a single triumph or resolution, but with an enduring reflection. The land can heal, but only if people respect its limits. The families who endured those years carried scars, yet they also carried knowledge that shaped farming practices, government policy, and cultural memory for generations to come. But one question remains, resting quietly in history. If another drought of that magnitude were to strike today, would we truly be prepared? Or would the lessons of dust and wind be forgotten once again? Asterisk, the image of the Great Depression is often captured in a single stark scene, a long line of weary men, coats pulled tight, hats low against the wind, waiting in silence for a meal they could not provide for themselves. These breadlines, stretching across city blocks, became one of the most enduring symbols of the 1930s. They were not only lines for food, but also quiet corridors of endurance, where pride met necessity, and where the very definition of survival was rewritten in the years before the Depression. Many working-class families had lived precariously close to hunger, even in times of prosperity. Industrial wages often covered only the bare essentials, and sudden illness or job loss could push a family into poverty. But when the stock market collapsed in 1929 and unemployment spread like a shadow across the nation, hunger grew from a private fear into a public crisis. By 1932, 1 in 4 American workers was unemployed. For millions, the paycheck that had once purchased bread, milk, or meat simply vanished. Hunger was not abstract, it meant empty cupboards and meals made of scraps. Families stretched food in ways both creative and desperate. Bread crusts were soaked in milk to become pudding. Potatoes were boiled and mashed into every possible form. On some days, supper might consist only of beans or cornbread, repeated day after day until taste itself became weary. Children carried lunch pails to school that held little more than a slice of bread or an apple. Teachers noticed the signs. Listless students, fainting in class, their eyes heavy, not from boredom, but from malnutrition, dot into this void stepped breadlines in soup kitchens. Charitable organizations, churches, and community groups opened their doors to the unemployed. At first, These efforts were small meals offered from church basements or community halls. But as the Depression deepened, the scale expanded. Entire city blocks were devoted to feeding the hungry. A man might stand in line for hours for a bowl of thin soup, a piece of bread, and perhaps a cup of coffee. For families, such meals could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. The experience of waiting in a breadline carried its own quiet weight. The lines were long, often stretching through the bitter cold of winter or under the heat of summer. Silence dominated. Men rarely spoke as they waited, perhaps ashamed of their need, perhaps conserving energy in bodies already weakened by hunger. Some brought their children, their small hands clutching at coats, their eyes wide at the sight of so many others in need. The food itself was modest. A soup kitchen meal might consist of stew made from donated vegetables, bread purchased in bulk, and coffee served in tin cups. It was enough to fill the stomach, if not to satisfy. Yet even this required enormous effort from those who organized it. Volunteers chopped vegetables, stirred enormous pots, washed countless dishes. Charitable donations kept the kitchen supplied, but the strain was constant. As more and more people arrived, lines grew longer, and the fear of running out of food before everyone was served haunted both cooks and those waiting. Private charity was not enough. By the early 1930s, municipal governments began to provide direct aid, funding soup kitchens and relief centers. Yet, relief carried stigma. Some people resisted accepting it, clinging to pride even as hunger gnawed at them. Others saw it as the only option, lining up day after day, their faces becoming familiar to the volunteers who ladled soup into bowls. Perhaps the most famous soup kitchens of the era were those operated by the gangster Al Capone in Chicago. In 1930, at the height of his notoriety, Capone opened a kitchen that served thousands of meals daily. Newspapers carried photographs of men eating bread and soup beneath signs that read, "Free soup, coffee, and donuts for the unemployed." Some saw it as charity. Others viewed it as a calculated effort to soften his public image. But for those who ate there, motives mattered less than the food itself. Women, too, bore the burden of hunger in distinct ways. Cute gains in countless households. Mothers went without meals so that children might eat. Stories tell of women claiming they weren't hungry while quietly watching their families eat the little food available. In cities, mothers lined up at relief centers to receive sacks of flour or cans of evaporated milk, carrying them home as if they were treasures. In rural areas, women stretched meals with ingenuity, watering down soups, baking with less sugar, substituting lard for butter. These small acts of sacrifice, repeated thousands of times, formed a hidden backbone of survival. The sight of breadlines shocked those who remembered the prosperity of the 1920s. Cities that had once bustled with shoppers and diners now displayed rows of men standing for a piece of bread. Tourists and journalists from abroad often remarked on the contradiction. America, land of abundance, where food was grown in vast quantities, now filled with hungry citizens waiting for handouts. The irony was sharp. Farmers destroyed crops they could not sell, while city dwellers begged for meals. Milk was dumped in ditches to keep prices stable, even as children went without. The hunger crisis reshaped communities. In some neighborhoods, churches doubled as relief centers, their pews cleared for tables where families could eat. Schools began to provide lunches for children, not as an educational service, but as a form of nutrition. Neighbors shared what little they had, trading food, recipes, or even just encouragement. These networks of quiet solidarity kept many afloat when official relief was slow or absent. Yet, for every act of kindness, there were also tensions. Some resented migrants who arrived in their towns, swelling the breadlines. Others viewed relief recipients with suspicion, accusing them of laziness. Politicians debated how much aid should be given. fearing that too much charity would erode self-reliance. The hungry, caught in the middle, endured both the emptiness of their stomachs and the weight of judgment. The culture of the breadline left lasting marks on those who experienced it. For many, it was their first encounter with public charity. For others, it was the moment when pride was broken by necessity. The memory lingered long after, shaping attitudes toward poverty and government aid for decades. Survivors often spoke of the humiliation of waiting in line, of the taste of watery soup, of the silence shared by strangers bound by hunger. Yet breadlines and soup kitchens also embodied resilience. They were proof that in times of collapse, communities found ways to feed one another. Volunteers, donors, and organizers became lifelines. A bowl of soup might seem a small thing, but to someone who had gone hungry, it was everything. And so, when we pictured those long lines stretching through city streets, we must ask ourselves, what was it like to stand there hour after hour with nothing but hunger to keep you waiting? What thoughts filled the minds of those men and women? Was it shame, despair, or a flicker of hope that tomorrow, perhaps, things would be different? Asterisk, by 1933, breadlines and soup kitchens had become a daily ritual in American cities. They were not exceptional sights anymore, but ordinary, woven into the rhythm of life in the Great Depression. A man might leave his apartment in the morning, not to go to work, but to take his place in a line that stretched around the block. Children, instead of stopping at candy shops, waited with tin cups for soup. Women carried jars and bags, hoping to bring something home for supper. These lines, at once monotonous and humiliating, became a quiet theater of endurance repeated thousands of times across the country. Asterisk, silence of the breadline carried a weight heavier than words. Men who had once been steel workers, clerks, or carpenters stood shoulder to shoulder with one another, each avoiding the eyes of those next to him. The act of standing in line for charity challenged their very identity. In a society built on ideals of self-reliance, the breadline was an open admission of need. Some covered their faces with hats or scarves, ashamed to be recognized. Others stood with weary defiance, as if daring anyone to judge them. Asterisk. The soup kitchens that served these lines varied widely. Some were clean and orderly, with long wooden tables, bowls stacked neatly, and volunteers moving efficiently with ladles and trays. Others were cramped with leaking roofs, smoky kitchens, and crowded benches, yet whether in a church basement or a hastily repurposed warehouse, the ritual was the same. Receive your bowl, find a place to sit, and eat in silence. The food was rarely memorable stews made from donated vegetables, bread that was sometimes stale, coffee that tasted of bitterness more than beans. But to the hungry, it was sustenance, and that was enough. Hunger, however, was not solved by one meal. Families returned day after day, their presence reminding the volunteers of just how vast the crisis had become. The kitchens, many run by religious organizations, stretched their resources as far as possible. Volunteers collected donations of potatoes, beans, onions, flour, and rice, turning them into endless variations of the same soups and stews. In larger cities, like New York and Chicago, some kitchens served thousands of meals a day, operating from morning until night. Government involvement grew, but slowly. At first, President Herbert Hoover resisted direct federal relief, believing that local charities and private organizations could manage the crisis. He feared that government handouts would weaken individual initiative. Yet by 1932, the scale of hunger was undeniable. Cities were running out of funds, churches could no longer meet demand, and images of endless breadlines filled newspapers. Critics argued that the government could not stand aside while millions went hungry. When Franklin Roosevelt entered office in 1933, his New Deal programs reshaped the landscape of relief. Federal funds began to support local kitchens and government. Surplus food was distributed to communities. Programs like the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, FERA, provided direct aid to states, allowing them to expand their feeding programs. For many families, these measures meant the difference between starvation and survival. Yet, even with federal support, the lines did not shorten overnight. Hunger was too widespread, unemployment too deep. The experience of breadlines revealed not only economic hardship, but also social fault lines. Immigrant communities, already familiar with mutual aid traditions, often organized their own relief. In neighborhoods of Italian, Jewish, or Polish immigrants, local associations collected food and distributed it within their communities. African American neighborhoods, facing both poverty and discrimination, often received less official aid, forcing churches and mutual aid societies to step in where governments hesitated. The stigma of relief shaped how people remembered these years. Many who stood in line spoke later of the humiliation, not just the hunger. A man who had once supported his family with steady wages now relied on ladled soup. Women who had prided themselves on keeping a household found themselves begging for flour or beans. Some children were teased at school for carrying relief bread in their lunches. Others grew up with the memory of standing beside their parents in the cold, waiting for a meal that never quite filled them. In rural areas, where soup kitchens were less common, hunger took different forms. Farmers who could not sell their crops often had food, but no money. They might eat cornmeal and beans in abundance, yet be unable to purchase shoes or medicine. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers, particularly in the South, fared worse, evicted from their land. They crowded into towns where breadlines stretched as long as those in the cities. Relief wagons sometimes brought sacks of flour, lard, and salt pork to rural families. But distribution was uneven and often delayed. The contradictions of the era deepened resentment. On one hand, Americans saw images of wheat surpluses being destroyed, destabilized prices, grain burned or dumped, milk poured into ditches, hogs slaughtered and buried. On the other hand, families stood in line for bread. The logic of economic policy clashed painfully with the reality of hunger. Children could not understand why food was wasted while their stomachs remained empty despite the hardships. Breadlines and soup kitchens created spaces of quiet solidarity. In the line, people recognized one another. The carpenter who once fixed your porch, the teacher from your child's school, the shopkeeper whose store was now shuttered all were there, reduced to the same need. Conversations, when they did happen, often centered on hope for work, news of jobs rumored in another part of town, or small encouragements shared among strangers. In this way, the breadline became not only a place of hunger, but also of community. However fragile, cultural memory of the breadlines was shaped by photographs and journalism. Kia Lang's images of tired faces, hollow eyes, and waiting. Crowds became part of the national record. Papers debated the causes of such widespread hunger, sometimes blaming government inaction, other times blaming personal failure. Yet the photographs told a simpler truth. Hunger was not selective. It touched men, women, and children from every background. Some children who grew up in those years later described a strange duality. On one hand, they remembered the gnawing of hunger and the humiliation of handouts. On the other, they recalled moments of kindness, the volunteer who slipped them an extra roll, the neighbor who shared sugar for their birthday cake, the church lady who always smiled as she ladled soup. These small acts softened the harshness of memory, leaving behind not just deprivation, but also human connection. By the mid-1930s, as New Deal programs expanded, the infrastructure of relief became more stable. Public works projects created jobs. School lunch programs fed children, and surplus food distribution became more organized. Yet the breadlines never fully disappeared until the economy revived at the end of the decade. They remained a daily presence, visible reminders of a nation struggling to feed its own. The breadline, in the end, was more than a line for food. It was a line that divided pride from necessity, independence from dependence, hope from despair. It was a place where hunger met dignity, and where communities, however reluctantly, acknowledged their shared vulnerability. And so, as we think of those endless rows of people waiting for bread or soup, a question lingers. What does it do, to a society when survival itself depends on standing in line, bowl in hand, waiting for the generosity of others? By the late 1930s, the sight of breadlines still lingered in American cities. But subtle changes were beginning to take shape. Where once every corner seemed to host a relief station or a kitchen, the lines now grew shorter in some places, not because hunger had vanished, but because new systems of aid had emerged. The federal government, having at first hesitated, now played a direct role in providing food to its citizens. The quiet desperation of the breadline began to be replaced by the slow machinery of organized relief. The New Deal programs launched under President Franklin Roosevelt had already reshaped the nation's approach to survival. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration FARA, and later the Works Progress Administration WPA, provided jobs that allowed families to earn wages instead of relying only on handouts. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration AAA sought to stabilize crop prices, ensuring that farmers did not destroy food in a paradox of waste while others starved. Most significant for the hungry were surplus food distribution programs. The government purchased excess agricultural products and distributed them directly to families. This shift changed the face of relief. Instead of waiting in a line for a ladle of soup, families might now receive a sack of flour, a tin of lard, or a package of beans to prepare at home. Relief kitchens did not disappear, but their role shifted from the center of survival to one part of a larger safety net. School lunch programs expanded, ensuring that children received at least one meal a day, often their most substantial. The very idea of public responsibility for feeding the hungry ones, controversial, was becoming part of the American system. Yet the memories of the breadlines did not fade quickly. For those who had stood in them, the humiliation remained sharp. A father who once prided himself on bringing home wages now recalled the shame of waiting in silence for bread. A child who had eaten thin soup in a noisy church basement remembered the sound of bowls clattering and the smell of boiled onions lingering in her clothes. These memories shaped an entire generation's attitudes toward poverty, work, and government aid. Many who lived through the Depression carried a lifelong fear of hunger, stocking pantries, and saving scraps long after prosperity returned. Asterisk. The experience of the breadlines also carried lessons in resilience. Families learned to stretch food in ways that would later seem unnecessary. Recipes from the Depression years mock apple pie made from crackers, coffee stretched with roasted barley casseroles designed to feed many from Little B became part of household traditions. These meals, born from scarcity, told stories of endurance. In literature and art, the breadlines became a lasting symbol. Photographs captured by the Farm Security Administration showed endless rows of men outside relief stations, their faces weary but composed. Writers described the quiet dignity of those who endured hunger without surrendering hope. John Steinbeck's works, though often centered on migrant workers, echoed the broader themes of deprivation and survival that breadlines embodied. Woody Guthrie sang of hard traveling, his verses capturing the voices of those who had stood in line. The broader society, too, could not forget. Even those who never stood in a breadline saw them daily in their cities, a constant reminder of the Depression's reach. The image of Americans waiting for food in a land of plenty struck deeply, raising questions about fairness, abundance, and responsibility. How could a nation that prided itself on prosperity allow so many to go hungry? This question lingered through the 1930s and into the decades that followed. Relief efforts were not perfect, distribution was uneven, and discrimination often shaped who received aid. Minority communities, particularly African Americans and immigrants, sometimes faced exclusion or smaller rations. In the South, racial prejudice meant black families were often given less or made to wait longer than their white neighbors. These inequities revealed that hunger was not only an economic problem, but also a social one, exposing divisions within American society. Yet hunger also built solidarity. Communities formed around shared need. Churches became places not only of worship, but of nourishment. Neighborhood networks quietly ensured that no child went entirely without. These bonds, though formed in hardship, sometimes lasted long after. The Depression, remembered as proof that survival was never entirely solitary. By 1939, with unemployment slowly declining and war looming in Europe, the lines had thinned further. The economy, though not fully healed, began to stir. Factories reopened, and demand for labor rose. For many families, this meant the chance to leave the breadline behind, and once again purchase food with earned wages. Relief kitchens continued to operate, but fewer relied on them. Hunger had not vanished, but it no longer defined every street corner. The onset of World War II accelerated this change. As the nation mobilized, industry surged. Unemployment dropped sharply as men enlisted and factories worked around the clock. Families that had once waited for soup now found themselves with steady jobs, sometimes for the first time in years. The breadline, once the emblem of the Depression, began to fade from daily life, but memory remained. Those who lived through the years of waiting never forgot. They recalled the smell of bread in cold air, the sound of footsteps shuffling forward, the weight of pride set aside for survival. Parents told their children stories of hunger, not to frighten them, but to teach gratitude. Camp parents kept pantries full, unwilling ever again to face empty shelves. The breadline became part of family lore, a cautionary tale passed from one generation to the next. In the larger arc of history, breadlines reshaped America's understanding of poverty. They showed that hunger could strike not only the chronically poor, but also the working and middle classes. Men who had once been secure in their jobs found themselves in line alongside those they had never considered equals. This blurring of social boundaries made hunger a shared national experience, not just a private misfortune. The lesson reached far beyond the 1930s. Later debates over welfare, food stamps, and school lunch programs carried the memory of the breadlines. Within them, policymakers remembered the photographs of men in hats waiting for bread. The statistics of malnourished children, the indignities endured by families forced into public need, the programs created in response to food stamp programs, surplus distribution, nutritional school meals were shaped by the determination that such hunger should never again define American streets. And yet, the haunting image endures. The lion stretching down the block, the silence of waiting, the taste of thin soup. It reminds us of a time when survival meant standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers, carrying hunger in their stomachs and pride in their silence. The Great Depression eventually ended, but the breadlines left their mark. They taught lessons about resilience, about the limits of private charity, and about the responsibilities of a nation to its people. They revealed both the fragility and the strength of communities, and they posed a question that has never fully gone away. In times of crisis, will we choose to look aside, or will we find ways to feed one another? Costa sits, the Great Depression did not begin in a dust storm or a breadline. It began on the trading floor of the New York Stock Exchange, where the rise and fall of numbers on chalkboards and ticker tape reshaped the course of the world. To many, Wall Street in the 1920s was the beating heart of prosperity. Yet prosperity built on fragile foundations can crumble in an instant. And when it did, the collapse spread far beyond the narrow streets of Manhattan, reaching into farms, factories, and kitchens across the globe. The decade leading up to the crash was known as the Roaring Twenties. It was a period of apparent abundance, marked by jazz music, flapper dresses, automobiles, and radios. Factories turned out goods in unprecedented numbers, and consumer credit allowed families to buy products they once could only dream of. Wall Street became the symbol of this confidence. Stock prices rose steadily, and newspapers told stories of ordinary clerks and farmers who invested their savings and saw them multiply. The idea that the market could only go up took hold of the public imagination. Speculation became a national pastime. People bought stocks not because they believed in the companies themselves, but because they believed prices would keep rising. Brokerage houses offered easy credit through buying on margin, allowing investors to purchase stocks with only a fraction of their own money, borrowing the rest. With as little as 10% down, one could control large amounts of stock. As long as prices rose, fortunes seemed inevitable. But such prosperity was built on leverage, fragile as paper in the wind. By the summer of 1929, warning signs appeared. Production in industries like steel and automobiles slowed. Farmers, already struggling from years of low crop prices, could not share in the prosperity. Yet, stock prices continued to climb, divorced from the realities of the economy. Many economists, journalists, and even bankers warned that the bubble could not last. Few wanted to listen. Optimism was intoxicating, and Wall Street seemed invincible. Then came October. On Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the market trembled. Prices fell sharply, and panic rippled across the trading floor. The day became known as Black Thursday. Crowds gathered outside the exchange on Broad Street, anxious for news. Banks and large investors rushed to stabilize the market, pouring in money to buy shares and calm fears. For a moment, it seemed they had succeeded. The weekend passed with reassurances in the press that the worst was over. But Tuesday, October 29th, told another story. That day became known as Black Tuesday, one of the darkest in financial history. The selling began as soon as the market opened and quickly turned into a flood. Investors, desperate to escape losses, sold at any price. Stocks that had seemed valuable only weeks before plummeted to fractions of their former worth. The ticker tape machines, which printed trades for investors to read, fell hours behind, unable to keep pace with the chaos. On the trading floor, brokers shouted, papers flew, and faces turned pale with dread outside. Crowds watched silently as the financial world unraveled. People who had invested their life savings saw them vanish in a single day. stories spread of men collapsing at their desks, of wealthy investors ruined overnight. The air was heavy with disbelief. How could wealth built over years evaporate so quickly? Yet, in those first months, many believed the crisis would be short-lived. Newspapers urged calm, insisting that the fundamentals of the economy remained strong. Politicians reassured the public that recovery was just around the corner. For time, some even believed that the market would bounce back, that the panic of October 1929 was an aberration, not a turning point. But as months passed, the downturn deepened. What made the crash so devastating was not only the fall of stock prices, but the shattering of confidence. The 1920s had been built on belief in progress, in endless growth, in the ability of markets to deliver prosperity. When that belief collapsed, it left behind uncertainty. Families who had once dreamed of buying homes or sending children to college now questioned whether they would have enough to eat. Investors who had spoken of fortune now spoke of survival. The collapse also revealed the fragility of an interconnected economy. American banks had lent heavily to Europe in the 1920s, helping nations recover from World War I when Wall Street fell. Those loans dried up, and European economies faltered in turn. International trade shrank, and the Depression became global. The fall of Wall Street was not a local disaster, it was the opening act of a worldwide crisis for the ordinary person. The experience of the crash was often confusing. Many had never owned stocks, never walked past the exchange, never read a ticker tape, yet they felt its effects. Factories closed, wages were cut, savings were lost. A man who had never invested a dime might still lose his job because his employer's credits dried up. A woman who had never seen Wall Street might still wait in a breadline because her husband's wages disappeared. The crash was both distant and intimate, abstract and immediate. As 1930 began, the memory of October 1929 hung over the nation. Families spoke of before the crash and after the crash as if it were a dividing line in history. The language of prosperity had given way to the language of survival. And yet, even as the Depression deepened, many still asked themselves, could such a collapse have been prevented, or was it the inevitable consequence of a decade built on paper wealth? Asterisk, in the months after October 1929, the panic of Wall Street spread outward like ripples on water. At first, some observers insisted that the crash was merely a correction, a painful but temporary shock to a market that had grown too exuberant. But as the weeks turned into months, it became clear that the collapse was not confined to stocks. It was a contagion of confidence, one that seeped into banks, businesses, canned households, until the very structure of the economy began to sag under its weight. The first visible sign was the banks. Many had lent heavily to speculators during the boom years, extending credit for stock purchases made on margin. When stocks fell, those loans could not be repaid. At the same time, nervous depositors reading headlines of Wall Street ruin rushed to withdraw their money. Banks, unlike vaults, did not keep enough cash on hand to satisfy everyone at once. They relied on the assumption that not all depositors would ask for their funds simultaneously. But in the wake of the crash, that assumption, dissolved bank runs became a defining feature of the early Depression years. Outside branch offices in towns and cities, lines of customers stretched down sidewalks. Some carried small savings accounts, others entire life savings. They stood in silence, fearing that the doors would close before their turn came. In many cases, the doors did close. Between 1930 and 1933, nearly 9,000 banks failed in the United States. Each failure rippled outward. A closed bank meant not only lost savings, but lost credit for businesses, lost mortgages for farmers, lost security for retirees, for families. The collapse of a bank was not an abstract event. It meant the disappearance of years of careful saving. A couple who had put away money for their children's education found it gone in an instant. A farmer who had borrowed for seed could no longer refinance his loan. In households across the nation, conversations turned to loss. The savings that vanished, the wages that disappeared, the sense of stability that crumbled. The collapse of Wall Street also reshaped daily routines. Businesses, suddenly cut off from credit, began to scale back. Factories slowed their production, then laid off workers. Stores reduced their hours, then closed altogether. Newspapers that had once filled their pages with stock tickers and market speculation now filled them with stories of bankruptcies, foreclosures, and auctions. Unemployment climbed relentlessly. In 1930, 1 in 9 workers was without a job. By 1932, the figure had risen to 1 in 4. Entire families relied on the wages of a single part-time worker, or on the patchwork of odd jobs, selling apples on street corners, taking in laundry, shining shoes. The optimism of the 1920s, when it seemed that everyone could prosper, gave way to a grinding uncertainty. People no longer spoke of getting rich, but of simply hanging on. The crash also left its mark on culture. The glamour once associated with Wall Street evaporated. In the 1920s, financiers had been portrayed as daring visionaries, symbols of progress. After the crash, they were often seen as reckless gamblers whose risks had destroyed the livelihoods of millions. Cartoons depicted bankers with top hats and cigars as villains. Public trust in the financial system collapsed alongside stock prices. In homes, the mood shifted. Families who had once spoken eagerly of new radios or automobiles now spoke of making do with what they had. Children wore hand-me-down clothes longer, shoes patched until they fell apart. Meals grew simpler stews stretched with beans, bread extended with fillers like cornmeal or potato. The crash, though born in distant offices filled with ticker tape, settled into kitchens and dining rooms as a daily presence. There was also a psychological toll. The crash created a sense that the ground itself was unreliable. Wealth that had seemed secure, whether in stocks, savings, or property, proved fragile. Confidence, once shattered, was difficult to restore. Families who had lived comfortably found themselves suddenly unsure of the future. For many, it was the first time. They had felt the raw edge of vulnerability. Yet, amid the despair, there were also adaptations. Some communities organized barter systems, exchanging goods and services without money. Farmers might trade eggs for cloth or firewood for medical care. Urban neighborhoods sometimes established credit unions or cooperative stores, pooling resources to survive. These efforts were small, often improvised, but they reflected the resilience of ordinary people. The federal government, however, struggled to respond effectively in the early years. President Herbert Hoover believed that the downturn was temporary and that the economy would right itself if confidence was restored. He urged businesses to maintain wages and employment, but as losses mounted, such appeals were ignored. His reluctance to provide direct federal relief earned him sharp criticism. For the unemployed, slogans like prosperity is just around the corner rang hollow against the reality of hunger and joblessness. The crash also reshaped politics. Anger at Wall Street grew into anger at Washington. Protest movements arose, from farmers demanding relief to veterans of World War II, who marched on the Capitol in 1932 to claim promised bonuses. The Bonus Army, as they were called, camped in makeshift shelters near the Capitol, only to be driven away by federal troops. The sight of veterans being tear-gassed in the nation's capital deepened the sense the government had abandoned its people. The global consequences of the crash further magnified its impact. European banks, already weakened by the burdens of post-war debt, faltered as American loans dried up. Germany, in particular, saw its fragile economy collapse, feeding political unrest. International trade shrank by more than half in just a few years. The Wall Street crash was not merely an American crisis. It was a global earthquake that shook economies from London to Buenos Aires. For the individual worker, however, the causes mattered less than the consequences. A man laid off from a Detroit auto plant, did not think of European debt or agricultural subsidies. He thought of rent due and children unfed. A woman whose small savings account vanished with her local bank did not ponder global trade. She wondered how to buy coal for the winter. The crash, though explained in financial terms, was lived in human ones. By 1932, despair had deepened into anger. Protesters marched with signs demanding jobs and food. Farmers organized penny auctions where they collectively bid low prices on foreclosed farms to return them to their original owners. In cities, the unemployed formed councils pressing local governments for relief. The crash had stripped away illusions of prosperity and replaced them with a raw demand for survival. Yet, even as hardship spread, one unresolved question hung over the nation. Could confidence in the system ever be restored? Could Americans, once betrayed by the fragility of paper wealth, ever again believe in markets, banks, and prosperity built on numbers that rose and fell so easily? By 1933, the collapse that had begun with a storm of selling on Wall Street had evolved into the Great Depression in full force. What started as panic among investors had spread into every corner of daily life. Breadlines in the cities, foreclosures in the countryside, shuttered factories in industrial towns. The initial crash was a moment, but its consequences stretched into years. The question was no longer how the market had fallen, but how the nation could rebuild trust in a system that had seemed both powerful and fragile at the same time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's election in 1932 marked a turning point. He entered office amid despair, promising a new deal for the American people. His inauguration speech, remembered for the phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself," addressed the psychological wound left by the crash. Fear had been as damaging as the fall of stock prices, freezing confidence, paralyzing investment, and spreading panic. Roosevelt sought not only to heal the economy, but to restore belief. One of his first actions was directed at the banks. The die. 1,933 thousands had failed, and many of those still standing were unstable. Roosevelt declared a nationwide bank holiday, closing all banks for several days while federal inspectors examined their books. Only those deemed sound were allowed to reopen. At first, people were skeptical, but when banks reopened with the president's assurance of stability, deposits began to return. Roosevelt reinforced this with his fireside chats over the radio, speaking directly to families in their homes, explaining in simple terms why banks were safe again. Reform followed swiftly. The Glass-Steagall Act separated commercial banking from investment banking, ensuring that ordinary deposits could not be gambled in risky speculation. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was created to guarantee deposits, giving savers confidence that their money would not vanish overnight. The Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) was established to regulate Wall Street itself, posing rules on trading, disclosure, and corporate reporting. These measures sought to prevent the kind of unchecked speculation that had inflated the bubble of the 1920s. But regulation alone could not erase the memories of ruin for those who had lost everything in the crash. trust in Wall Street never fully returned. Many families swore off investing for a generation, keeping their money in savings accounts or even in cash hidden at home. The stock market, once seen as a path to quick wealth, now carried the scent of betrayal for the unemployed. The reforms brought some hope, but little immediate relief. The crash had wiped out not only paper wealth, but also demand for labor. Roosevelt's New Deal created programs to put people to work. The Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and others. Men planted trees, built roads, and repaired public buildings. Women found work in sewing rooms or as teachers in federal programs. These jobs did not restore the prosperity of the 1920s, but they put food on tables and gave dignity to families worn down by idleness. The legacy of Wall Street's collapse extended beyond economics into culture. The image of stockbrokers leaping from windows, though exaggerated in popular memory, became a symbol of the fragility of paper wealth. Plays, novels, and songs of the 1930s often carried themes of distrust toward finance and yearning for simpler, more stable lives. Hollywood films contrasted the excess of the rich with the struggles of the poor, reflecting a society that had seen how quickly fortune could turn. Internationally, the crash altered power balances. As American credit dried up, Europe's fragile recovery from World War I collapsed. German unemployment soared, feeding political extremism that would eventually lead to the rise of the Nazi regime. The ripple effect of Wall Street's fall was global, reshaping politics as much as economies. In this sense, the crash was not just a financial event, but one of the sparks that helped ignite the turbulence of the 1930s and 1940s. For ordinary Americans, the lessons of the crash remained personal. Parents taught their children's thrift, warning against the dangers of debt. Families who had once spent freely now saved cautiously, keeping emergency funds hidden away. Even when prosperity returned in the post-war years, the memory of 1929 lingered. Elderly survivors often described a lifelong reluctance to trust banks or the stock market. Shaped by the scars of vanished savings, the reforms of the 1930s did succeed in creating greater stability. Deposit insurance restored faith in banks. Securities regulation curbed some of the wildest speculation. The Federal Reserve, chastened by its role in the early years of the Depression, adopted more active policies to prevent future collapses. But no regulation could erase the fundamental truth revealed in 1929, that an economy built on speculation, unchecked leverage, and blind optimism could collapse overnight. Even today, when historians look back at the Wall Street crash, they see more than a financial event. They see a moment when confidence, that fragile yet essential element of any economy, evaporated in a storm of selling. They see how paper wealth, though dazzling in its rise, offered no shelter when winds turned. And they see how ordinary people, far from the marble columns of Wall Street, carried the true weight of the collapse in their kitchens, homes, and daily routines. The story of Wall Street's collapse is not simply one of numbers, charts, and financial instruments. It is the story of workers laid off, families evicted, children hungry. It is the story of a nation forced to confront the limits of its prosperity. It is also the story of resilience, of reforms built from ruin, of trust rebuilt slowly, and of lessons etched deep into collective memory. Yet, one question endures. Echoing across decades of financial history, can safeguards ever truly prevent another collapse? Or does every generation, in its own way, forget the lessons of paper wealth and face them once again? The hum of machinery is a sound easily taken for granted. In the 1920s, it filled the cities of America's steel presses pounding in Pittsburgh. Auto assembly lines whirring in Detroit, textile looms rattling in New England mills. This was the soundtrack of prosperity, the mechanical rhythm of a nation that had staked its identity on production. But when the Great Depression spread its weight across the economy, those sounds fell silent. The factories that had once defined entire communities grew cold, their smokestacks idle, their windows shuttered, their gates locked. For the men and women who lived in industrial towns, silence became the most unsettling sign of crisis. A factory was not just a building, it was a lifeline. Entire neighborhoods clustered around it, dependent on its wages for rent, food, and stability. When the gates closed, the impact rippled outward. Stores lost customers, schools lost tax revenue, and families lost hope. The Great Depression was not abstract in these places. It was heard in the absence of clanging metal, felt in the emptiness of pay envelopes, seen in the boarded windows of once thriving businesses. The collapse of industry was tied directly to the crash of 1929 and the contraction of demand that followed. Consumers, reeling from lost savings and rising unemployment, stopped buying. Automobiles, radios, furniture, clothing goods that had seemed essential in the 1920s suddenly became luxuries. Without customers, production slowed. Without production, workers were laid off. It was a chain reaction, and it repeated itself in city after city. Detroit, the symbol of America's industrial strength, was among the hardest hit. In the 1920s, Henry Ford's assembly lines had revolutionized car production, and the city had grown rapidly, drawing workers from across the country and immigrants from abroad. But as the Depression deepened, car sales collapsed. By 1932, automobile production had fallen by nearly 75% compared to the boom years. Factories stood idle, their machines covered in dust. Tens of thousands of auto workers, once the backbone of Detroit, found themselves unemployed. Entire neighborhoods built around Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler faced ruin. Steel towns like Pittsburgh faced similar fates. Without demand for cars, construction slowed. Without construction, the need for steel evaporated. Blast furnaces that had glowed with molten fire now stood cold. Workers who had labored in shifts around the clock sat idle on their porches, listening to the silence that had replaced the roar of production. In some towns, unemployment reached staggering levels. Half the workforce, sometimes more, left without wages. The textile mills of New England, already strained by competition and declining demand, faltered further. Workers, many of them women, faced reduced hours or outright closures. Mill towns that had once thrived on steady wages now struggled to survive. Families pawned belongings, took in boarders, or relied on soup kitchens. Children who had once gone to school in neatly pressed uniforms now wore patched clothing, the fabric showing the wear of too many seasons. The shutdown of factories revealed how deeply industrial work shaped identity. A man who had worked the same machine for 20 years found himself adrift without it. His skill. At the same time, the factories themselves became eerie symbols. Journalists who toured industrial districts described rows of silent buildings, their smokestacks still, their gates rusting. In photographs, one sees empty floors where machines sat idle, dust gathering on conveyor belts that had once carried endless products. These images, stark and still, captured the scale of collapse more powerfully than numbers ever could. Communities responded in varied ways. In some places, workers organized protests, demanding jobs or relief. Marches through industrial cities drew attention to the desperation of the unemployed. In Detroit, unemployed councils formed, pressing for public works projects to revive the city. In Pittsburgh, steelworkers rallied, not only for jobs, but also for union recognition, seeing in their suffering a chance to demand long-denied rights. Yet, for many, survival was quieter. Families planted gardens, bartered services, or took in laundry. Women stretched meals, finding ways to feed families on beans, bread, and occasional scraps of meat. Children collected coal along railroad tracks, gathering what had spilled from cars to heat homes. Neighbors shared resources, not out of abundance, but because no one could survive alone. The decline of industry also reshaped migration. Workers who had once come north for factory jobs now considered leaving. Some returned to rural areas, hoping to live off the land. Others joined the streams of migrants moving westward in search of work in California's fields. Industrial towns, once magnets of opportunity, now saw families depart, their houses abandoned, their communities hollowed out. Politically, the silent factories became a powerful symbol. Photographs of idle machines and unemployed workers appeared in newspapers, underscoring the urgency of reform. Roosevelt's New Deal sought to address this collapse through programs like the National Industrial Recovery Act, which encouraged industries to set fair wages and hours while stimulating demand. The Works Progress Administration provided jobs in construction and infrastructure, absorbing some of the unemployed workers from idle factories. But the scale of the problem was immense, and relief was never complete. For those who lived through it, the silence of the factories left a lasting impression. It was not simply the absence of work, but the absence of rhythm, of purpose, of identity. The sound of machines had been more than noise, it had been proof of progress, of belonging to something larger. Its disappearance left a void that no relief check could fully fill. As the 1930s stretched on, some factories reopened, slowly regaining production. Others never did, casualties of an economy that had shifted. By the time World War II arrived and demand for weapons, ships, and vehicles reignited industry, entire communities had spent nearly a decade in the shadow of silence. The war revived production, but it could not erase the memory of years when machines had gone cold. The question that lingered was not only how to restart industry, but how to prevent such silence from returning. Could policies and safeguards ensure that factories would never again stand idle on such a scale? Or was the Great Depression a reminder that even the strongest machines depended on forces markets to demand confidence that no steel press could withstand? When a factory closed its doors during the Great Depression, the silence did not stay contained within its walls. It echoed outward, across streets and neighborhoods, across families and daily routines, until entire towns seemed to carry the weight of its absence. The loss of industry was not only about idle machines, it was about disrupted lives, broken rhythms, and communities forced to reinvent themselves around scarcity. Factories were more than workplaces. They were social anchors. The whistle that marked the start of a shift structured the day not just for workers, but for whole neighborhoods. Children walking to school timed their steps to the sound. Shops opened early to catch workers on their way in, and taverns filled as shifts ended. When the whistle stopped, an entire rhythm of life broke down. The silence spread beyond the gates. Storekeepers saw fewer customers, barbers fewer clients, schools fewer supplies. For the unemployed worker, identity itself became unstable. A machinist in Pittsburgh or an assembly line worker in Detroit often defined himself by his craft. When the machines went cold, his sense of usefulness dimmed. Letters from the 1930s revealed the anguish of men who felt ashamed to face their families with empty hands. Women, already burdened with managing households, carried new weight-stretching food, pairing clothes, and finding small ways to supplement income. Children took on odd jobs, shining shoes or selling newspapers. Their playtime sacrificed to necessity. Labor unrest grew from this despair. In some industrial towns, workers organized marches demanding jobs or relief. In 1932, the Ford Hunger March in Dearborn, Michigan, turned violent when police clashed with demonstrators calling for employment and aid. 4 workers were killed, dozens injured. The event became a symbol of the desperation in Detroit, where auto plants, once filled with thousands, now stood partly empty. Other protests took quieter forms. Workers staged sit-down strikes, occupying factories, rather than leaving them idle. They argued that if machines could not be used for production, they would not be surrendered to silence either. These strikes, though controversial, highlighted the tension between owners seeking to cut losses and workers demanding survival. The very buildings that had grown silent became arenas of conflict, their stillness broken not by machines, but by chance and negotiations. For many, however, survival meant adapting to smaller forms of work. Families planted gardens in backyards or vacant lots, producing vegetables to supplement thin diets. Women took in sewing, laundry, or borders. Men scavenged scrap metal, hauled coal, or worked day labor jobs when they appeared. In towns where factories had once defined employment, the economy fractured into a patchwork of odd tasks and bartering. The effects on children were profound. Schools remained open, but funding dwindled as tax revenues fell. Teachers described students fainting from hunger, their notebooks filled with careful handwriting interrupted by smudges of fatigue. Yet schools also became places of resilience. In some districts, hot lunches were introduced for the first time, ensuring that children received at least one meal a day. Though modest often soup, bread, and milk, these meals stood as lifelines. The communities around factories bore visible scars. Boarding houses, once filled with migrant workers searching for jobs, emptied. Local diners and shops closed, unable to survive without workers' wages. Houses fell into foreclosure, families moving away or doubling up with relatives. Streets that had once bustled with the noise of shifts changing now seemed eerily quiet, their sidewalks carrying fewer footsteps. Their storefronts darkened. Cultural attitudes toward industry shifted as well. In the 1920s, factories had symbolized progress and modernity. Photographs showed gleaming machines, efficient assembly lines, and cities rising on the strength of steel and labor. By the 1930s, those same images took on a different tone. Silent smokestacks became emblems of despair, a reminder that prosperity was not permanent, but precarious. Writers described the ghostly emptiness of once thriving mills, their interiors filled not with noise, but with dust. The government attempted to respond with measures designed to restore industry. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, of 1933 encouraged businesses to set minimum wages and fair hours, seeking to prevent the worst abuses while stimulating demand. Public works programs like the WPA and CCC absorbed unemployed workers into new forms of labor, building roads, bridges, and parks. These jobs, though outside the factory gates, offered wages and a sense of dignity. Yet they could not fully replace the vast loss of industrial work for women. The closure of factories brought both hardship and opportunity. Many men, unable to find jobs in industry, resisted the idea of their wives entering the workforce. But necessity overruled tradition. Women found jobs in service industries, in sewing rooms funded by New Deal programs, or in schools and hospitals. Their earnings, though modest, kept households afloat. This shift quietly began to alter gender roles as women's economic contributions became visible in new ways. Despite these adaptations, silence of the factories remained oppressive. In oral histories, survivors often spoke less of specific hardships than of the atmosphere of the stillness that replaced the once familiar clatter. It was the sound of stalled progress, of waiting for something that did not arrive. Men remembered walking past their old workplaces, peering through locked gates at the machines they had once operated, as if looking at a part of themselves left behind. The global consequences of industrial silence were just as stark. America's factories had been engines not only for domestic goods, but for exports. As production slowed, international trade contracted. Nations dependent on American machinery, textiles, or steel saw shortages, compounding their own economic crises. The Depression was never contained within borders. The silence of a Detroit assembly line echoed in markets across the world. Yet, even in its gloom, seeds of change were planted. The crisis forced unions to gain strength as workers realized that their vulnerability was collective, not individual. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, founded in 1935, organized workers across entire industries rather than by craft. Auto workers, steel workers, and textile workers found new voices, demanding rights and protections that would reshape labor for decades. The memory of silent factories also instilled caution in the generations that followed. Workers who endured the Depression often carried lifelong anxieties about job security. Parents advised their children to save, to learn trades that might endure downturns, to never take wages for granted. The stillness of the 1930s became a warning carried forward. That prosperity, no matter how solid it seemed, could vanish as suddenly as the hum of machinery. By the late 1930s, signs of revival began to appear. Factories reopened cautiously. Production resumed in fits and starts. But it was not until the onset of World War II that industry truly roared back to life. The demand for weapons, vehicles, and equipment transformed silent buildings into beacons of activity once again. Workers returned to their posts. Machines whirred, smokestacks smoked. Yet the memory of the long silence never left them. And so, one question remained, whispered across industrial towns that had endured nearly a decade of stillness. Could the sound of machinery ever again be trusted to last? Or would silence always linger at the edge of prosperity? By the late 1930s, the stillness that had settled over America's industrial towns began to lift, slowly, unevenly, and never entirely. Factories that had stood, shuttered for years, stirred back to life. Men were called back to machines they had abandoned, though often at lower wages and shorter hours than before. For many families, the sound of machinery worry again felt like a fragile promise. Perhaps the silence was not permanent after all. The revival was tentative. Some industries, like steel and automobiles, reopened plants, cautiously testing demand. Others, like textiles, never fully recovered to their pre-depression levels. In mill towns across New England, closures from the early 1930s left scars that did not heal. Families who had left rarely returned, and some mills became permanent ruins. Yet, in larger industrial centers, production did pick up, spurred partly by New Deal spending on infrastructure and public projects. Government contracts for bridges, dams, and roads demanded steel, cement, and machinery, feeding some life back into idle factories. Still, it was not prosperity. For many workers, the Depression years of silence had altered expectations. Wages were lower, benefits minimal, and hours uncertain. Men who had once worked overtime now felt grateful for part-time shifts. Women who had entered the workforce during their husband's unemployment often kept their jobs even as factories reopened, signaling a quiet but lasting change in the household economy. Then, as the decade turned, global events reshaped industry more decisively than any domestic program. The outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1939, followed by America's entry in 1941, transformed the silent factories into centers of urgency. Orders for weapons, ships, tanks, and airplanes poured in. The same factories that had once produced cars and steel beams were retooled for military production. Assembly lines that had sat dormant now ran around the clock. The change was dramatic. In Detroit, auto plants became the arsenal of democracy, producing tanks and bombers. In Pittsburgh, blast furnaces roared again, pouring steel, not for skyscrapers, but for battleships. In shipyards, welders worked day and night, their sparks lighting the docks. The silence of the early Depression gave way to a din of industry, greater than anything the nation had ever seen. Unemployment, once catastrophic, fell to record lows. Women entered factories in unprecedented numbers, filling roles vacated by men who went to war. The image of Rosie the Riveter symbolized this new industrial workforce, bridging the silence of the 1930s with the urgency of the 1940s. For communities that had endured a decade of stillness, the transformation was overwhelming. Streets, once lined with boarded-up shops, filled again with customers. Envelopes, once empty, now held steady wages. Families that had relied on gardens and soup kitchens returned to stores with cash in hand. The sound of whistles, shift changes, smokestacks became once more the heartbeat of towns that had nearly given up hope. Yet, even as prosperity returned, the memory of silence remained. Workers who had lived through the Great Depression did not forget the years when factories went cold. Many spoke of those years as a warning, a reminder of how quickly abundance could vanish. They carried with them habits born of scarcity, saving a portion of every wage, repairing rather than replacing, keeping pantries stocked against the possibility of want. The legacy of silent factories also reshaped labor. During the Depression, unions had grown in strength, fueled by the desperation of unemployed workers and the recognition that survival required collective power. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, CIO, had organized workers across industries, uniting auto, steel, and textile laborers. By the time factories revived, unions were stronger than ever, ready to demand fair wages, safer conditions, and recognition. The silence had given birth to voices that would not be ignored politically. The memory of idle factories reinforced the importance of government intervention. Many believe that without the New Deal's public works, projects, and regulations, industry might never have revived enough to meet wartime demand. Programs like the Wagner Act, which protected workers' rights to unionize, and the Fair Labor Standards Act, which established minimum wages and maximum hours, were rooted in lessons learned from the collapse of the early 1930s. The silence had proven that unregulated markets could not guarantee stability. Reform was necessary to protect both workers and industry itself. Culturally, the stillness of the Depression left its mark on art, literature, and memory. Writers described the ghost towns of industry, where machines stood like skeletons of a vanished age. Photographers captured haunting images of silent assembly lines, empty warehouses, and abandoned tools. These images became part of the nation's memory, reminders that progress was not inevitable, but fragile. In families, stories of the silent years passed down as warnings. Parents told children of nights without heat, of fathers pacing with nothing to do, of mothers stretching a loaf of bread for a week. These stories carried both sorrow and resilience, shaping the values of the next generation. For many who grew up in the Depression, the sound of a factory whistle was not only a call to work, but a reassurance that silence had been defeated. Before now, by the time the war ended in 1945, America stood at the height of industrial power. The silent factories of the Depression had been transformed into engines of global dominance. Yet the memory of the 1930s lingered as a shadow, reminding all who lived through it that prosperity was not permanent. The silence of the factories had taught lessons no machine could erase. That industry depended on demand, that communities depended on industry, and that confidence could vanish as quickly as it appeared. The Great Depression's silent factories remained one of its most haunting symbols. They stand as reminders of the fragility of modern economies, of the human cost when production ceases, and of the resilience required to endure years without the hum of machinery. And so, quaint lingers even decades later. If the machines were to fall silent again, would we be better prepared? Or would we once more hear the uneasy echo of stillness in the heart of industrial America? Asterisk, when work vanished and savings disappeared, many families in the early years of the Great Depression discovered that they could no longer afford a roof over their heads. Rents went unpaid, mortgages foreclosed, and the fragile security of home life dissolved. With nowhere else to turn, thousands built dwellings out of whatever scraps they could find: old wood, tin, cardboard, tar paper, clustered together in makeshift settlements. These places, scattered across America, became known as shantytowns. Over time, many acquired another name, Hoovervilles, bitterly referencing President Herbert Hoover, who was widely blamed for the depth of the crisis. To walk into a Hooverville in the early 1930s was to step into a city of improvisation. Streets were little more than dirt paths lined with huts and shacks of uneven height. The walls of one shelter might be made from wooden crates, the roof of another patched with tarps or sheets of tin pulled from a junkyard, cardboard covered, gaps, flattened cans, reinforced corners. Inside, the furniture was equally makeshift boxes, as tables, crates, as chairs, old newspapers layered as insulation. A fire might burn in a barrel outside, its smoke drifting upward as residents gathered for warmth. These shantytowns appeared in cities, large and small. In New York, one of the most well-known Hoovervilles grew in Central Park, where homeless families took over an empty reservoir bed and built a miniature city within the heart of Manhattan. In Seattle, a sprawling Hooverville stretched along the waterfront, housing hundreds of people. Chicago, St. Louis, and countless smaller towns saw similar settlements rise in vacant lots, abandoned industrial sites, and riverbanks. No place was immune to the sudden growth of these fragile cities. The residents of Hoovervilles were diverse. Some were unemployed industrial workers, laid off as factories closed. Others were farmers, driven from their land by foreclosure or dust storms. Families who had once enjoyed modest middle-class lives found themselves neighbors with men who had long lived on the margins. Hunger and homelessness erased distinctions. Poverty became a unifying condition. Daily life in Hoovervilles was a mix of hardship and adaptation. With no running water, residents carried buckets from public pumps or nearby streams. Cooking was done over open fires, often with shared pots of stew made from whatever could be gathered. Clothing was patched repeatedly, shoes repaired until they barely held together. Illness spread easily as sanitation was minimal. Yet, even in such conditions, people created routines. Children played in the dirt streets, neighbors exchanged food, and small communities formed rules to keep order. The bitterness embedded in the name. Hooverville reflected widespread anger at the federal government's inaction. Too many. The settlements symbolized Hoover's failure to respond effectively to mass unemployment and homelessness. Newspapers published photographs of the shacks, contrasting them with Hoover's assurances that prosperity was near. The irony was sharp. In a nation of skyscrapers and abundance, citizens lived in huts of tin and ashdod. Despite their fragility, Hoovervilles developed social structures. In some, residents elected unofficial mayors or councils to maintain order, settle disputes, or organize shared resources. Informal economies emerged. Residents bartered goods, repaired one another's clothing, or pooled money to buy food. Churches and charities sometimes visited to distribute bread or blankets. Though resources were always scarce, the settlements, while desperate, revealed a stubborn will to survive. Life in Hoovervilles was marked by constant insecurity. Police often raided the camps, sometimes burning shacks or forcing residents to leave. Cities considered the settlements blights on the landscape, embarrassing reminders of failure. Yet destroying one Hooverville often led to the rise of another, as the underlying problem of homelessness remained unsolved. For the residents, each eviction meant rebuilding, gathering scraps anew, and starting over on another patch of land. The stigma of living in a Hooverville weighed heavily. Children from the settlements were teased at school, their clothes marked by poverty. Adults felt the shame of dependence, of being labeled as failures. And yet, among residents, solidarity grew. Neighbors helped one another with repairs, shared meals, and protected children. Within the fragility of tin and cardboard walls, bonds formed that softened the hardness of survival. Newspapers and photographers who documented Hoovervilles brought their stark reality into the homes of Americans who had never seen them firsthand. The images of ramshackle huts against the backdrop of cities like New York or Seattle shocked many. They showed not an invisible poverty hidden in alleys, but a visible city within a city, an undeniable statement that prosperity had collapsed by the mid-1930s. As Roosevelt's New Deal programs expanded, some relief reached Hooverville residents. Public works projects provided jobs, while housing initiatives offered modest alternatives to shacks. Yet Hoovervilles did not vanish overnight. For many, they remained the only option until economic recovery gained momentum. To imagine life in one of these shantytowns is to consider both despair and resilience. Families, once anchored in stable homes, adapted to shelters made of tin and wood. Communities, stripped of comfort, created new forms of order. And amid anger and shame, people endured, waiting for a world where the sound of hammering might build not scraps of survival, but homes of permanence. But one question hovered over every Hooverville. From the reservoir bed of Central Park to the waterfront of Seattle, how long could people endure such fragile shelters? And what would it take to transform cities of ash into something more lasting? Asterisk Hooverville was not simply a scattering of shacks. It was a living organism. Each had its own rhythm, its own improvised rules, and its own quiet stories. Though they were built from scraps, they held together lives that had been uprooted by the Great Depression. To walk through one was to witness a society in miniature, fragile, improvised, but unmistakably human. Inside the boundaries of these settlements, families arranged their lives with as much normalcy as they could manage. A shack might be no larger than a single room, its roof patched with tar paper, its floor uneven boards. Yet within it, parents tried to maintain routines, bedtimes for children, simple meals at regular hours, Sunday prayers whispered even without a church. Newspapers served as insulation on walls. Tin cans became lanterns when fitted with candles. Old flour sacks, stitched carefully, became curtains or makeshift clothing. Nothing was wasted. Everything was repurposed. Cooking was a communal affair. Fires burned in oil drums or pits dug into the ground. Residents often pooled ingredients, creating stews that stretched to feed many. Pot of beans simmered beside potatoes, carrots, or onions when available. Someone had a piece of meat, it was added sparingly, flavoring the broth rather than serving as the main portion. In this way, scarcity became a form of sharing. Anger pressed constantly, but meals were moments of fellowship, where families sat together and pretended, for a time, that they lived in homes of brick and would rather than scrap and ashed out. Children adapted in their own ways. They played games in the dirt streets, using sticks as bats, tin lids as coins, or chalk lines scratched into the earth as boundaries. Their laughter echoed strangely against the backdrop of hardship, a reminder that youth found ways to endure, even in bleakness. Some attended school, though the stigma of living in a Hooverville followed them into classrooms. Teachers often recognized them by their patched clothes and thin lunges, but many looked the other way, offering quiet kindness where they could. Tensions, however, were ever present. Authorities often viewed Hoovervilles as nuisances or threats. Police raids were frequent, especially in cities where officials worried about crime, disease, or the simple embarrassment of visible poverty. Residents sometimes awoke to find their shacks torn down or burned by order of the city. These evictions forced families to scatter, only to rebuild elsewhere. The resilience required to reconstruct homes from scraps again and again spoke to a stubborn will. But it also deepened the bitterness toward institutions that seemed more intent on erasing the evidence of poverty than solving its causes. Despite the insecurity, Hoovervilles often created their own forms of governance. In larger settlements, residents chose informal leaders or councils to maintain order. Disputes over space, shared fires, or scavenged materials needed resolution. Rules against theft or violence were enforced by community agreement, since calling the police could bring destruction rather than help. These improvised governments were fragile but necessary, proof that even in hardship, people sought structure and fairness. Life in Hoovervilles also revealed inequalities. Families with more resourceful members often built sturdier shacks, scavenging better wood or tin. Single men, lacking family networks, sometimes lived in more precarious shelters, vulnerable to hunger and illness. Women carried enormous burdens, keeping households together, caring for children, and often finding small ways to earn money, like sewing or washing clothes for others. Some women worked outside the settlements as maids or laundresses, returning each night to shacks that bore little resemblance to the homes they once kept. Health was a constant concern. Without sanitation, disease spread easily. Outhouses were dug hastily. Water often carried from unsafe sources. Atees rarely visited, and few could afford medical care. Coughs lingered, wounds healed slowly, and malnutrition weakened bodies. In winter, the cold pressed into thin walls, forcing families to huddle around fires that barely kept frost from forming indoors. In summer, the heat made tin roofs unbearable, turning shacks into ovens. Yet residents endured, adapting with blankets, fans made of cardboard, or by sleeping outside when weather allowed. Despite the bleakness, Hoovervilles held moments of humanity. Neighbors watched over one another's children. Men shared cigarettes or told stories around barrel fires. Music sometimes drifted through the camp's harmonicas, fiddles, or voices raised in song, defiant against despair. Holidays were marked with whatever could be gathered. A shared meal of bread, beans, or stew became a feast when framed by gratitude. The political meaning of Hoovervilles was inescapable. Their very name carried accusation. To live in one was to embody criticism of President Hoover's policies, or lack thereof. Protesters sometimes carried signs through the camps, calling for jobs and relief. Politicians who visited could not ignore the sight of families living in huts built from trash. Hoovervilles forced the nation to look directly at its poverty, stripping away the illusion that suffering was hidden or isolated. And yet, there were more than symbols. There were homes, however fragile, two real people navigating each day. A child doing homework by candlelight, a mother patching clothes late into the night, father searching for work by day and returning to a shack by evening. These were the rhythms of Hooverville life. They revealed the persistence of dignity amid degradation as the 1930s wore on. Roosevelt's New Deal programs began to offer alternatives. Public housing projects, though limited, provided some families with sturdier shelter. Relief checks, though modest, reduced the reliance on scrap-built huts. Waypod jobs allowed men to leave the settlements during the day and return with wages. Slowly, Some Hoovervilles shrank, but they never vanished entirely. Even as the economy improved, many remained, stubborn reminder of years when ordinary homes were replaced by cities of tin and ash. Looking back, historians see Hoovervilles not only as evidence of poverty, but as proof of resilience. They showed how people adapted when abandoned by the institutions meant to protect them. They revealed the ingenuity of survival, the creativity of building homes from debris, the solidarity of shared meals, the persistence of community amid despair. And yet, the haunting question lingered: if prosperity could collapse so quickly, if homes could turn into shacks overnight, what guarantee was there that the fragile shelters of Hoovervilles might not rise again in some future crisis? By the late 1930s, the outlines of Hoovervilles began to fade. They had grown during the hardest years of the Great Depression, springing up in empty lots and abandoned spaces across the country. But as economic recovery slowly advanced under Roosevelt's New Deal, some of the need for these shantytowns diminished. Work relief programs, modest though they were, gave unemployed men and women new means to survive. Public housing initiatives, though limited in scope, offered sturdier alternatives to huts of tin and cardboard. And yet, Hoovervilles did not vanish all at once. They lingered as stubborn reminders of poverty, even as prosperity slowly returned. The decline of Hoovervilles was uneven. In some cities, authorities dismantled them as soon as alternative housing became available. Bulldozers cleared away the shacks, and land was repurposed for parks, warehouses, or new developments. In other places, Hoovervilles endured until World War II, when industrial mobilization revived employment and lifted families into steadier housing. For many residents, the war effort, pulling men into factories, women into offices, and families into steady wages, became the final escape from life in the shacks. Yet, for those who lived in them, the memory of Hoovervilles was indelible. Oral histories collected decades later reveal how deeply the experience shaped people's sense of security. Former residents spoke of winters endured with little heat, of roofs patched endlessly against rain, of nights spent listening for police who might arrive to dismantle their fragile homes. They remembered the solidarity too: neighbors sharing food, children playing amid scraps, families protecting one another against despair. These memories carried both bitterness and pride, marking a chapter in American life that was as humiliating as it was resilient. The New Deal had attempted to address the crisis of housing with initiatives like the Public Works Administration's housing projects. These early efforts built modest but durable housing complexes, offering alternatives to shantytown life. Though criticized for their limited scale and strict rules, they represented an acknowledgement that shelter was a public concern, not merely a private responsibility. The very existence of Hoovervilles had forced the government to confront the problem directly, changing the national conversation about poverty and housing. Photographs taken during the 1930s ensured that Hoovervilles would not be forgotten. Images of ramshackle huts against the skyline of New York, or families gathered around barrel fires in Seattle, speak in part of the visual record of the Depression. They circulated in newspapers and later in history books, reminding generations that poverty in America had once been visible on such a scale. The starkness of these images challenged the narrative of unbroken prosperity, proving that even in a land of abundance, shelter could vanish in an instant. Politically, Hoovervilles became symbols of failure. The name itself linked them directly to Herbert Hoover, whose cautious policies and resistance to federal relief earned him lasting criticism. Though Hoover himself did not create the shantytowns, his name became inseparable from them, a shorthand for the government's failure to respond quickly to mass suffering. Roosevelt's New Deal, by contrast, was seen as an effort to move people out of such conditions, however imperfectly, for many families. The end of the Depression did not erase the lessons of Hooverville life. Survivors carried habits shaped by scarcity, saving every scrap of material, repairing items endlessly, distrusting the permanence of prosperity. Parents told their children of nights spent in tin-roofed huts, of meals of beans and bread stretched to feed many. These stories instilled both caution and gratitude, showing that the memory of Hoovervilles lived on in households long after the last shack was dismantled. The decline of Hoovervilles also reshaped American ideas of community. In those settlements, people had built order from chaos, creating informal governance, barter systems, and shared spaces. They revealed that even amid poverty, people sought structure and dignity. Later housing and welfare policies, though bureaucratic and formalized, carried echoes of the lessons learned in Hoovervilles, that people did not simply need shelter, but also the chance to maintain community and self-respect. When World War II arrived, the transformation was dramatic. Factories reopened, production surged, and unemployment plummeted. Families who had lived for years in shantytowns suddenly found themselves with wages sufficient to rent apartments or buy modest homes. Women who had entered the workforce in new numbers contributed to household stability. The Hoovervilles, once sprawling on city edges, shrank rapidly as residents moved into sturdier housing. By the mid-1940s, most had disappeared, their remains bulldozed or weathered away. Yet, their legacy endured. Historians point to Hoovervilles as both a symptom and a lesson. A symptom of the government's initial inability to address mass unemployment, and a lesson in the resilience of ordinary people. They serve as reminders that shelter, something so fundamental, can never be taken for granted. They also highlight the visibility of poverty. Hoovervilles forced the public to look directly at homelessness on a scale too large to ignore. Culturally, Hoovervilles left their imprint as well. In novels, photographs, and documentaries, they became icons of the Depression era. Writers described the huts of tin and cardboard as monuments to desperation, but also as places where humanity persisted. Filmmakers used them as backdrops to stories of hardship and endurance. In classrooms, children learned of them as symbols of an era when America's wealth and poverty stood side by side. Even today, the memory of Hoovervilles raises questions. What happens when economic collapse strips people of homes? What responsibilities does a society bear toward those who lose everything? How do people preserve dignity in the face of such loss? These questions, sharpened by the images of tin-roofed huts and barrel fires, echo far beyond the 1930s. The story of Hoovervilles is not one of triumph, but of endurance. They remind us that even in the most fragile shelters, people created homes, however temporary. They remind us that poverty, though humiliating, can also reveal resilience. They remind us that prosperity, no matter how strong it seems, can unravel, leaving families to rebuild their lives from scraps. And so, the memory of cities of ash lingers fragile, uncomfortable, but necessary. The shacks of tin and cardboard may be gone, but the questions they posed remain in times of crisis. Will a nation ensure that its people have more than roofs of scrap, or will the Hoovervilles rise again in new forms, visible against the skyline of plenty? Asterisk in the sweeping photographs and newsreels of the Great Depression. Men in breadlines and families in shantytowns dominate the frame. Yet behind them, quieter and less visible, stood the children. They were the ones who carried the burdens of hunger in their growing bodies. The ones who adapted silently to the absence of toys, warm meals, or steady schooling. Historians have called them the forgotten children of the Depression. For while adults debated policy and survival, children endured the consequences in ways that shaped the rest of their lives. Childhood in the 1930s was stripped of its softness, okay? In prosperous times, even working-class children might expect the stability of school, the promise of shoes that fit, the comfort of meals that filled. In the Depression, these expectations dissolved. Many children woke to empty cupboards, their breakfasts reduced to bread dipped in lard or watered-down milk. Lunch boxes carried to school often held nothing more than a potato, an apple, or a single sandwich to be split among siblings. Teachers reported fainting spells in classrooms, children too weak to concentrate on lessons. Malnutrition, stunted growth, dulled energy, and in some cases left lifelong effects on health. School itself was no guarantee. Families unable to afford shoes or clothes sometimes kept children home, ashamed to send them in tattered garments. Others withdrew children entirely, needing them to contribute to survival. Boys took on odd jobs, delivering papers, shining shoes, selling apples on street corners, while girls helped at home, sewing, cooking, or caring for younger siblings. In rural areas, children worked in fields, picking crops alongside parents for meager wages. Childhood became a time not of play, but of labor, a contribution to the household economy that was often essential for children who did attend school. The experience was marked by scarcity. Teachers, themselves underpaid, often purchased supplies out of their own pockets. Textbooks were reused year after year, sometimes falling apart at the seams. Classrooms grew crowded as schools consolidated resources. Yet, despite these obstacles, many children clung to education as a fragile hope. Parents, even in poverty, urged them to study, believing that learning might one day lead to opportunities beyond the struggles of the present. The psychological toll of the Depression on children was subtle but deep. Many grew up with a constant awareness of financial insecurity, overhearing hushed conversations about rent, eviction, or overdue bills. They felt the stress of parents who skipped meals to feed them, or the shame of being teased for patched clothes. Some internalized the hardship as a sense of personal failure, believing themselves different from children in wealthier families. Others carried a quiet resilience, learning to endure scarcity without complaint. Leisure, when it existed, was redefined by necessity. Store-bought toys were rare luxuries. Instead, children invented games with what was at hand. Marbles carved from clay, dolls fashioned from rags, baseballs improvised from bundled string. Radio programs became a treasured escape, offering stories and music that lifted spirits for an hour each evening. Libraries, free and warm, became sanctuaries where children could read, and dream beyond the limits of their circumstances. The experiences of Depression-era children were not uniform. Urban children faced the harshness of breadlines and crowded tenements, while rural children often knew the monotony of farm labor and the exhaustion of dust storms in the plains. African American children, especially in the segregated South, endured both poverty and racial discrimination, often excluded from relief efforts or receiving less aid than white families. Migrant children, traveling with their parents in search of work, suffered the instability of constant movement, living in tents or cars, attending schools only briefly before moving on. Some stories revealed the quiet heroism of these children. In oral histories, adults who had been children in the 1930s recalled walking miles to gather firewood, scavenging discarded vegetables from markets, or watching over younger siblings while parents searched for work. These acts were rarely recognized, yet they sustained households. In many cases, children bore responsibilities far beyond their years, stepping into roles of laborer, caretaker, or provider. Relief efforts eventually reached some children. The Works Progress Administration and other New Deal programs sponsored school lunches in certain districts, providing at least one reliable meal a day. Charitable groups distributed clothing, often donated by wealthier families. In rural areas, surplus food programs offered cans of milk or sacks of flour. Teas, though uneven, provided lifelines. For a hungry child, a bowl of soup at school could make the difference between illness and survival. Yet, the shame of poverty lingered. Children often spoke of the embarrassment of wearing clothes stitched from flour sacks, or of bringing relief bread to school. Some recalled standing in line with parents at soup kitchens, their presence a painful marker of family hardship. These memories, small but piercing,